Hello everyone, this is day 4 and we are continuing with our lecture series on Anglo-Saxon poetry and Christian literature. This is part 3. Poems such as Deor, the Seafarer, the Wanderer grapple with suffering, exile, fate and transience. These poems revealed a society deeply conscious of the instability of human existence. Yet, they also demonstrated something else. Alongside their heroic inheritance, many of these works contain ideas that reflect the growing influence of Christianity. To understand how this transformation occurred, we must now shift our attention from the poetry itself to the cultural revolution that made a new kind of literature possible. The arrival of Christianity in England did much more than introduce a new religion. It transformed the intellectual foundations of society. In many respects, Christianity altered the very meaning of literature. The heroic culture of the Anglo-Saxons had been largely oral. Its stories were preserved through memory, performance, and communal recitation. Christianity, by contrast, was fundamentally a religion of the book. Its authority rested upon sacred texts that required reading, interpretation, commentary, and preservation. Consequently, the spread of Christianity created a demand for literacy and learning on a scale previously unknown in Anglo-Saxon England. This development had profound literary consequences. Monasteries became centers of education, clerics acquired knowledge of Latin, which was regarded throughout medieval Europe as the language of scholarship, theology, and intellectual discourse. Manuscripts were copied, preserved, and circulated. Gradually, England developed a literary culture that extended beyond oral performance. Literature could now exist not only in the memory of poets, but also on the pages of books. It is difficult to overstate the significance of this transformation. Without Christianity, much of Anglo-Saxon literature would never have been preserved. The same monks who copied biblical texts also recorded heroic poems and elegies. Ironically, many works that originated in pagan environments survived because Christian scribes considered them valuable enough to preserve. The result is a literary tradition in which heroic and Christian elements coexist, sometimes harmoniously and sometimes uneasily. Christianity also introduced a radically different understanding of history. In heroic culture, the past was primarily a record of ancestral achievements. Kings traced their lineage to legendary heroes. Glory was measured through military success, generosity, and reputation. Christianity expanded this historical perspective by situating human life with a divine framework. The history of humanity was no longer simply the history of tribes and kingdoms. It became part of a larger narrative that began with creation, continued through the fall of Adam and Eve, and moved towards salvation through Christ. Human existence acquired a cosmic significance. This new worldview inevitably affected literature. The heroes of Christian poetry differ from those of heroic verse. Although they often retain many heroic characteristics, Christ himself is frequently presented in terms that would have been familiar to an Anglo-Saxon audience. He appears not as a passive figure but as a courageous leader, a victorious warrior, and a lord surrounded by loyal followers. Christian writers adapted the language of heroic society to express religious ideas. In doing so, they created a uniquely Anglo-Saxon form of Christian literature. Before examining individual poets, it is important to understand another practical consequence of Christianization. The Anglo-Saxons originally used the runic alphabet, a writing system well situated for inscriptions on wood, stone, and metal. Runes could effectively record short messages, but they were not ideal for extensive literary compositions. Christian missionaries introduced parchment, ink, pens, and the Roman alphabet. These innovations made large-scale manuscript productions possible. The technology of writing changed, and with it, the possibilities of literature itself. The monasteries quickly became centers of literary activity. Initially, most educated writers composed in Latin because it was the international language of learning. Consequently, some of the early significant literary figures associated with Anglo-Saxon England wrote primarily in Latin rather than Old English. Among these figures, Aldhelm occupies an important place. Aldhelm, who lived during the late 7th and early 18th centuries, served as a bishop of Sherborne and was renowned throughout England for his learning. Although he reportedly composed works in both English and Latin, only his Latin writing survives. His surviving works include letters, riddles, and a treatise praising virginity. His style was highly learned and often elaborate, characterized by complex vocabulary and extensive circumlocution. While modern readers may find his prose difficult, Aldhelm represents an important stage in the development of English intellectual culture. He demonstrates that Anglo-Saxon England was already participating in broader European scholarly traditions. Even more influential was Bede, often known as Venerable Bede. Few figures in early English history command greater respect. Living between 673 and 735, Bede spent most of his life within the monastic communities of Wearmouth and Jarrow in Northumbria. Yet despite this seemingly secluded existence, his intellectual influence extended across Europe. Bede produced approximately 40 works on theology, science, history, and biblical interpretations. His scholarship established standards that would shape medieval learning for centuries. Bede's greatest achievement is undoubtedly the ecclesiastical history of the English people. Completed in 731, this work remains one of the most important sources for a knowledge of early English history. Without Bede, many events of the Anglo-Saxon period would be known only imperfectly, or not at all. The book records the conversation of English kingdoms, the activities of missionaries, the development of the church, and numerous historical episodes. It also provides valuable information about literary figures, including the poet Caedmon. Bede's significance extends beyond the information he preserves. He helped create the idea of the English people as a unified community. Although political unity remained incomplete during his lifetime, Bede's history presents the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as participants in a shared historical destiny. In this sense, he contributed to the formation of English identity itself. One of the most memorable passages in Bede's history concerns a humble cowherd named Caedmon. According to Bede, Caedmon was initially unable to compose poetry. Whenever the harp was passed around during communal gatherings, he would leave in embarrassment. Is historically accurate is impossible to determine. What matters is the cultural significance of the story. It presents poetry as a divinely sanctioned activity and establishes a model for Christian literary creation. The poet becomes an interpreter of sacred truth rather than merely a celebrant of heroic deeds. Caedmon's most famous surviving work is Caedmon's Hymn, often regarded as the earliest surviving poem in English literature. Although the poem is extremely brief, its historical importance is immense. It celebrates God as creator of heaven and earth and demonstrates how Christian themes could be expressed through the language of heroic poetry. What is particularly striking about the hymn is the way it adapts traditional heroic vocabulary. God is described as a ruler, protector, and keeper of the heavenly kingdom. These are the terms that Anglo-Saxon audiences would normally associate with earthly kings. The poem therefore translates Christian theology into the conceptual language of heroic society. Rather than abandoning older cultural forms, it reinterprets them. This process of adaptation characterizes much of Anglo-Saxon Christian literature. The Christian God often resembles an ideal Anglo-Saxon lord. Angels appear as loyal retainers. Spiritual conflict is depicted through the imagery of warfare. The result is literature that remains deeply rooted in Germanic culture even as it expresses Christian beliefs. The influence of Caedmon extended beyond the hymn itself. Medieval tradition associated him with the larger body of biblical poetry preserved in what is now known as the Junius manuscript. Although modern scholars question whether Caedmon personally composed all these works, they nevertheless belong to what is often called the Caedmonian tradition. This tradition sought to render biblical narratives into vernacular words that ordinary audiences could not understand and appreciate. Among the most important poems associated with this tradition are Genesis, Exodus, and Daniel. These works do not simply translate scripture. Instead, they transform biblical stories into narratives that resonate with Anglo-Saxon heroic values. The heroes of the Bible often behave like Germanic warriors, while their struggles resemble the conflict familiar from heroic poetry. Perhaps the most revealing example appears in Exodus. In the biblical account, Moses serves as a prophet and leader guiding his people to freedom. In the Old English poem, however, Moses also resembles a heroic war leader. He inspires courage, directs military-like action, and commands the loyalty of his followers, much as an Anglo-Saxon lord would command his retainers. The Israelites themselves appear not merely as a chosen people, but as a disciplined heroic community. This adaptation demonstrates once again how Anglo-Saxon writers reconcile Christianity with inherited cultural traditions. Rather than rejecting the heroic past, they incorporated it into a Christian framework. The values of courage, loyalty, and leadership remained important, but they were redirected towards religious ends. By the 8th century, therefore, Anglo-Saxon literature had undergone a remarkable transformation. Poetry no longer focused exclusively on earthly heroes and tribal history. It increasingly addressed biblical narratives, theological questions, and spiritual concerns. Yet the methods of expression remained recognizably Anglo-Saxon. The heroic imagination continued to shape literary representations even as Christianity redefined the goals of literature. By now, we have seen how Christianity transformed the literary culture of Anglo-Saxon England. We discussed the growth of literacy, the role of monasteries, the contributions of Bede and Caedmon, and the emergence of biblical poetry in vernaculars. We also observed that Christianity did not completely replace the heroic traditions of the Germanic past. Instead, Christian writers adapted familiar heroic language and imagery to communicate religious ideas. This process reaches one of its highest achievements in the works associated with Cynewulf and in the remarkable poem The Dream of the Rood, which many scholars regard as one of the masterpieces of Old English literature. Unlike Caedmon, whose biography survives through Bede's narratives, Cynewulf remains a somewhat mysterious figure. Very little is known about his life. Scholars generally place him in the late 8th or early 9th century, and he is often thought to have been associated with Northumbria. What distinguishes Cynewulf from many other Old English poets is that he signed several of his poems using runic letters embedded within the text. Through these signatures, his name has survived, allowing modern readers to identify at least a portion of his literary output. The poems attributed to Cynewulf include the Fates of the Apostles, the Ascension Juliana, and Elaine. Although these works differ in subject matter, they share certain characteristics. They display a sophisticated understanding of Christian theology, a preference for narrative expansion beyond the biblical source material, and a remarkable ability to combine religious instructions with poetic imagination. One of the most important features of the Cynewulf's poetry is his tendency to move beyond simple paraphrases. Earlier poets often retold biblical stories in heroic language. Cynewulf, by contrast, frequently uses these narratives as opportunities for mediation and reflection. His poetry is not merely descriptive but interpretive. He seeks to explore the spiritual significance of events and to encourage readers towards moral and religious understanding. This tendency is particularly evident in The Ascension, a poem preserved in the Exeter Book. The work begins by recounting Christ's departure from earth and an ascension into heaven. However, the poem gradually expands into a broader meditation on salvation, divine grace, and the destiny of humanity. Cynewulf is not content simply to narrate an event. He continually pauses to interpret its meaning and to draw lessons for his audience. The poem therefore functions both as literature and as religious instruction. Perhaps the most ambitious of Cynewulf's work is Elaine, which narrates the story of Saint Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine, and her search for the true cross. What makes the poem particularly interesting is the way it incorporates elements of heroic adventures. Voyages, quests, confrontations, and acts of determination all contribute to the narrative. Once again, Christian history is transformed into a form that would appeal to audiences familiar with the heroic literature. The significance of Cynewulf extends beyond the poem directly attributed to him. His style influenced a broader body of religious poetry, often referred to as the Cynewulfian tradition. This tradition includes works such as Andreas, A Good Like Bee, and the Phoenix. Together, these poems reveal the growing confidence of Anglo-Saxon Christian literature. Writers were no longer merely adapting biblical stories, they were developing a sophisticated literary culture capable of exploring complex theological and philosophical questions. Among all the poems associated with this tradition, none has attracted more attention than The Dream of the Rood. preserved in the Vercelli book and partially inscribed on the famous Rood cross, and the poem occupies a unique position within English literary history. It is at once visionary, symbolic, theological, profoundly poetic. Many scholars consider it one of the earliest and finest examples of Christian imagination in English literature. The poem begins with the dream vision. This is important because the dream vision would later become one of the most influential literary forms of the Middle Ages. The narrator falls asleep and experiences a remarkable vision in which he sees the cross upon which Christ was crucified. Yet this is no ordinary cross. It is simultaneously a physical object, a sacred symbol, and a speaking character. As the dream unfolds, the cross itself becomes the narrator. It recounts the events of the crucifixion from its own perspective. This narrative strategy immediately distinguishes the poem from controversial religious writing. Instead of focusing solely upon Christ, the poem allows the cross to testify as a witness to the central event of Christian history. What follows is one of the most extraordinary reinterpretations of the crucifixion in medieval literature. In the Gospels, Christ's death is presented primarily in terms of sacrifice, suffering, and redemption. In the Dream of the Rood, these elements remain present, but they are expressed through the language of heroic culture. Christ does not appear as a passive victim. He emerges as a heroic warrior, willingly entering the battle. The poem describes Christ approaching the cross with determination and courage rather than being forced into suffering. He embraces it voluntarily. The image would have resonated strongly with an Anglo-Saxon audience. The ideal warrior did not shrink from danger. He confronted it willingly in pursuit of honor and duty. By presenting Christ in these terms, the poet transforms the crucifixion into a heroic act. Equally remarkable is the role assigned to the cross itself. The cross behaves like a loyal retainer. It serves its old faithfully despite the immense suffering involved. Just as an Anglo-Saxon warrior was expected to remain loyal to his lord even in the face of death, the cross remains steadfast in its support of Christ. The relationship between Christ and the cross therefore mirrors the Lord-Thane relationship that formed the foundation of heroic poetry and society. This adaptation demonstrates the extraordinary creativity of Anglo-Saxon Christian poets. Rather than abandoning traditional cultural values, they interpreted them within a new range of religious framework. Courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and honor remained central virtues, but their significance was transformed. Heroism was no longer delivered solely by military success. It became associated with spiritual commitment and divine purpose. The poem's imaginary further reinforces the synthesis. The cross appears both glorious and blood-stained. It is simultaneously a symbol of suffering and triumph. This duality reflects a central Christian paradox. The instrument of death becomes the instrument of salvation. Through Christ's sacrifice, defeat is transformed into victory. The poem repeatedly emphasizes this reversal, inviting readers to perceive beyond appearances and recognize the deeper spiritual reality. The dreamer's response to the vision is equally significant. Having witnessed the testimony of the cross, he experiences a profound transformation. The vision inspires devotion, hope, and a renewed understanding of salvation. The poem therefore moves from narrative to personal reflection. It does not merely recount a sacred event, it seeks to shape the spiritual consequences of its audience. The importance of the Dream of the Rood lies not only in its religious message but also in its literary achievement. The poem demonstrates how successfully Anglo-Saxon writers integrated heroic and Christian traditions rather than existing in opposition. These traditions enrich one another. The result is a work that remains deeply rooted in Germanic culture and simultaneously expressing Christian theology. As we reach to the conclusion of today's lecture, it is useful to step back and consider the larger significance of Anglo-Saxon poetry. We begin by examining the formal characteristics of Old English verse, alliteration, caesura, variation, and kennings. We then explored the role of the scop and the oral culture from which this poetry emerged. Through Widsith, we encountered the heroic celebration of memory, fame, and cultural identity. Through Deor, the Seafarer, and the Wanderer, we discovered a more reflective tradition concerned with suffering, exile, and transience. Finally, through Caedmon, Cynewulf, and the Dream of the Rood, we observed how Christianity transformed literary expression while preserving many aspects of the heroic inheritance. Several key themes unite this diverse body of literature. The first is the awareness of transience. Whether in heroic or Christian concepts, Anglo-Saxon writers repeatedly emphasize the impermanence of earthly life. Kingdoms decline, wealth disappears, friends die, and human achievements fade. This awareness generates both melancholy and wisdom. The second theme is the search for permanence. Heroic cult sought permanence through reputation and fame. Christian cult located permanence in God and eternal salvation. Although these solutions differ, both respond to the same fundamental and human concern of transcendence, of permanence. The third theme is the importance of loyalty. In heroic poetry, loyalty binds warriors to their lords. In Christian poetry, loyalty binds believers to God. The structural change is, but the underlying value remains remarkably consistent. Finally, Anglo-Saxon literature reveals a society negotiating profound cultural change. The transition from paganism to Christianity was neither sudden nor complete. Instead, it produced a rich and complex literary tradition in which old and new ideas continually interacted. The poem preserves traces of both worlds, allowing modern readers to witness one of the most significant cultural transformations in European history. For students of English literature, the Anglo-Saxon period is important not simply because it comes first chronologically. It establishes many themes that continue to shape English writing for centuries. Questions about identity, exile, faith, mortality, memory, and the relationship between individual experience and larger historical forces first emerge here with remarkable clarity. The foundations of English literary culture are therefore laid not only in the heroic walls of the Anglo-Saxon warriors but also in the monasteries, manuscripts, and visionary poetry of Christian England. In our next lecture, we will move beyond the Anglo-Saxon period and begin examining the profound images changes brought about by the Norman conquest. We will explore how the arrival of the Normans transformed language, society, and literature, paving the way for the development of Middle English and the literary world of the Chaucer. Thank you for listening. Do follow and subscribe to the channel and comment below for your suggestions.